As Barbados tourism workers continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, officials are working to create a more inclusive, diverse, and resource-efficient future. According to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, international tourist arrivals plunged globally by 87% in January this year, amid new outbreaks and tighter travel restrictions across the world. Looking ahead, the organization projected two possible scenarios for 2021, with the first projecting a 66% increase in international arrivals by July this year compared to historic lows of 2020. The second scenario forecasts a potential rebound in September, leading to a 22% increase in arrivals compared to last year. On this evening's One-on-One, we look at the repositioning of Barbados tourism product in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine well underway, we take a look at the country's gradual lifting of travel restrictions and the government's plan to advance the transition towards a more resilient and robust tourism economy. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for One-on-One. I am your host, Lisa Lord. Our special guest is the Minister of Tourism and International Transport, Senator the Honorable Lisa Cummins. Minister, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Now let's take a look back at the past year. It was an extremely rough year. Let's look at some numbers from actual arrivals to loss of revenue, loss of jobs.
So to say it was a rough year probably would be an understatement. We had businesses that did not have any activity and therefore no revenue for the better part of a year. You had, when this began in 2019, for example, people may have had residual revenues from 2018, but 2019 rolled into 2020 and people had not earned for over a year. Businesses, I should say, had not earned for over a year. And that resulted in a people impact. The people who then close to 45,000 in total direct and indirect tourism jobs affected. And so to say that the fall off was significant would be an understatement. If we then started to look at what a normal year in Barbados would look like, we would be talking about tourism arrivals coming in from the airport. Well over 1.2 million passengers would normally disembark at Grantley Adams on an annual basis, either on short stay or long stay, and that would include usually the persons who are coming to join cruises. Then when you start to talk about cruising, when 2019 ended prematurely in February, we by that time had exceeded the estimates of well over 840,000 visitors by then. Over the course of 2020, we had no sailings at all. And so we're now in 2021, and the sector is absolutely at all levels reeling from what has been a difficult year and a half by now.
When international countries started locking down, what was your initial reaction?
I don't know if I think that there's a single initial reaction that you have. So last year, for example, we would have seen the UK go into its first wave. And then the decision was made to go into lockdown because it needed to contain the surge of infections. We ourselves had a lockdown period in the first part of last year. Perhaps not by now, but over a year, perhaps a year in March. And then in January, we saw Canada go back into lockdown. We watched different provinces within Canada, Quebec, Montreal, and so on, go into lockdown. And then we saw Canada itself suspend all flights to the Caribbean and to Mexico through April 30th. And then we saw the UK also go into lockdown. In the initial stages of the UK lockdown, people were still traveling for elective reasons. But then, because so many people were traveling to avoid the lockdown in the UK, they then went into an entirely different mode where leisure travel overseas became illegal. And so when we talk about international arrivals, and I use that as a benchmark only because the historical approach to tourism has been about arrivals, how many persons come via cruise or air, and the importance of that to supporting the wider economy. and then how that impacts on the wider economy, specifically the accommodation sector for hotel occupancy rates, and the range of indirect and direct aspects of the economy, whether it's agriculture, the number of farmers that are providing produce to the restaurants or the hotels, the number of farmers and local producers of goods that are manufactured that are providing services to shops and bars in the rural parts of the country that are close to, say, tourist attractions that depend on visitors coming to the island. The impact was extensive, and we're typically used to measuring tourism using those metrics, which are important. And so if you think about all of that and you put that in the frame of arrivals, and you then look at what happened with the source markets, you know that immediately when those countries started to go into lockdown, the ripple effect here in Barbados was going to be significant. The fact that every other country around the globe and that the World Tourism Organization, the World Tourism and Travel Council, every major economic grouping, large, small, developed, developing, were simultaneously dealing with the same things didn't give any of us any comfort, because ultimately we're responsible for what happens here, even when it's not within your full control. And so the key has been for all of us mitigating the impact of what is happening locally, mitigating the impact of what is happening in our source markets as they go into lockdown and they are navigating what travel will mean for them. But most importantly, the key thing for us has been using this time not to lament over things over which we don't have any control at all, but to build a new architecture for a new tourism industry that is going to have to emerge when this is all over.
One of the things we did have control over was keeping our airport open, which was heavily criticized. Do you stand by that decision?
We stand by that decision. During the latter part of the year, from January to March, for example, we saw approximately just 6,081 visitors coming through Barbados. That's a stunning number when compared to what a normal year would look like. But what's important about that number is that we are a migratory country. We have more Barbadians potentially living out of the country than we do living at home. And the majority of people who came home during the latter part of last year and up until March this year are Barbadians. People who are coming home to their families. People who are coming home, who came home for Christmas, for example, who did not and could not have anticipated what happened when we ourselves went back into lockdown at the end of the year. There are Barbadians who came home for relatives' funerals, who came home for all different kinds of reasons. And I think one of the things that we are most proud of as a nation is the fact that Barbados, we have a song about it to that effect. Barbados will always be home. And there can never be a circumstance where, as we saw in way too many instances in other countries, Barbadians cannot find their way back home. And so we stand by that decision, even at this point.
Which brings us now to 2021. We know that the protocols are being put in place for the reopening of the sector. And by that, I mean a major influx of visitors. But are we ready?
Lisa, I think one of the things in the Ministry of Tourism that we have spent a lot of time on is what we would have to call iterative learning. Where we were in February of 2019, when I was in a different space and a different time, is not where we were in February 2020. And where we were in February 20 and in April 2020 is most definitely not where we are in April 2021. And so the dynamics have changed, and we think we've figured out what the risk methodologies look like. So yes, we have a series of protocols that have been iterative. They have been based on all that we have learned with our public health officials over the course of the last year and some. They have been built in collaboration with the University of the West Indies. They have been amazing. They have built models that project what risk looks like. And if we're talking about risk, I mean, if we're driving in a car, for example, we know that if we're driving in a car, there's a potential always of getting into an accident. But your risk of injury is mitigated by your use of a seatbelt. It is mitigated by your use of a seatbelt correctly. It is mitigated by the presence of airbags in your car, for example. And it's the same thing with us navigating the implementation of protocols. And so the University of the West Indies, the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners, and the Ministry of Health and Wellness have looked at all of the various scenarios and built risk mitigation models that say to us, if this happens, then that is going to be the impact. If that happens, then this is going to be the impact. And these are the steps that we have to take in order to ensure that we find the right mix. And the right mix may be great for today, but the circumstances could change in another week or a week after, and we'll have to look at it again and consistently and constantly follow the science, follow the advice of our public health officials and our medical practitioners and our academics in the University of the West Indies, and ensure that our risk mitigation strategies are always what is required for the moment, because everything is going to be time specific. So the new protocols, for example, have allowed us to benefit from our dependence so far on the PCR testing. We took a lot of time looking at what type of test the international community would be using. The Ministry of Health and Wellness continues to insist on the gold standard PCR. So we use that. But here is what became interesting. All across the Caribbean, different countries, and I'm only in the Caribbean now, different countries had different time frames prior to arrival when the test would be done. In some instances, you had countries that said 5 days before arrival. In other instances, we even had one country that said you could take a PCR test 10 days prior to arrival, and then you can come into the country. Barbados never followed those models. Barbados always made the determination that one, you have to have a negative test no more than 72 hours prior to arrival. That was part of the risk mitigation strategy. There was a time where very few countries, except 2 others in the Caribbean region, were doing a mandatory second test. Barbados, for a long time, insisted, and we were the only one insisting on it, that there had to be a mandatory second test. Now across the region, many countries are doing the same thing. Equally so, the mandatory quarantining in hotels and not allowing people to just go wherever they needed to be and trust their judgment that they would remain where they said they would be. That mandatory quarantine requirement has also now been implemented in places like the UK, where previously it never existed. And so in a lot of ways, I think we have to give our public health officials a credit for being trailblazers and for applying risk-based measures that were appropriate for the time. Were there going to be people, Lisa, that didn't do what they were supposed to do? I think we realize that in life that is always going to be the case in any scenario. But for the most part, I think there has to be something to be said for a country that had the highest possible standard, that many called a gold standard, that maintained very low COVID levels for close to 8 to 9 months. There's something that has to be given credits about that. And I think our public health officials really must be lauded for the extraordinary work that they did in one, working on developing the protocols and then administering them. But if I can then go a little further to say, in this latest incarnation, we've gone even further, Lisa. We have consulted so widely on how different aspects of the sector are affected by the protocols, how they're impacted, what needs to be tweaked. We brought in the University of the West Indies, and so we've taken science to a different level by using the modeling. The Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners as well. So these new protocols that have been approved, and I think the Prime Minister spoke about them, have gone through that iterative process over time, but also that iterative process through various stakeholders. And we're confident that what we have here now is what is needed. And if there is a time, and the time will come, we're sure, based on all that we've learned, that we have to make changes, we will absolutely do that using the same process or any other process that we deem appropriate based on what is required of us at the time.
This is April. You're set to welcome about 10 cruise ships, I believe, by June.
Yo, you don't know this is your boy Molly, aka Daddy No Land, and I can't reason we wanna seriously. Look, because of COVID-19, everybody online now. But be careful. If somebody online who don't know you ask you your name, where you live, what your parents do for a living, The answer is no. Don't give it out. Don't give your information to nobody. And I mean nobody. Even if it's one of your friends. Ask you to share naked pictures, sexual pictures, so no. Remember what posted online stays online and just end up in the dark web. But don't delete. If you playing a game and they offer you free things, if you come in a private chat room with them, so no. Somebody like that up to no good. Remember, keep your password safe so nobody can hack your account. So no to giving it out when you're in your classroom. Respect your classmate and your teachers. Saying no to posting porn. Stop it. So stay safe and we can get through this together. Remember to sanitize and wear one a mask. And this is a message from the daddy. Big up on yourself.
This is April. You're set to welcome about 10 cruise ships, I believe, by June.
Not by June. The first cruise ship we're expecting to begin sailings for the summer. We're expecting at the end of June, and then there will be others that will follow in July. And this is something that is really important to us because I think Prime Minister has talked about it, that for over 20 years in our history, because of the hurricane season, that we have not been a place where ships have been home porting, or we've not had a summer cruising season. They've always sailed starting November through April. But here we are now, beginning cruising again in the Caribbean. Cruising has been in place since last year in Europe. Royal Caribbean in particular has also announced home porting from Israel and Singapore and others, and we're very pleased to be among the international partners that have worked on the development of new standards on board cruise lines to mitigate the spread. Testing is a critical part of boarding. Now all of the cruises are vaccine only, and I think that's an important point to make. They are vaccine only. All crew members are vaccinated. All passengers are vaccinated. And we will be in the tourism industry pushing for persons to consider a balance of testing and vaccinations in terms of workers, because we want to make sure that everybody, especially those people who are on the front line of the industry, are protected. But testing is going to be routine when we resume cruising. And we're very pleased that the cruise lines have been able to invest significant resources in on-ship testing, on-ship equipment for laboratory services, and they can do their testing on board. And we have been working with them to ensure that their tests conform with what we have here. During the course of next week, I will be meeting with my colleague ministers of tourism, in particular those from the Eastern Caribbean, to discuss coordinating what those protocols will look like. Because if you think about it, for air travel, you're leaving and you're going perhaps to a single destination. It's a controlled space. But for cruising, you're stopping in multiple places, multiple locations. So it's important that we are all on the same page and that we're all administering equal or at least equivalent standards in all countries. And so I will be working during the course of this coming week with my colleague ministers of tourism, particularly on ships that are home porting out of Barbados this summer, to ensure that we have uniform standards wherever possible across the board.
As you said, uniform standards, because I just wanted, for the sake of clarity, you will be treating to cruise passengers different to visitors arriving by plane.
Yes. So there are very specific protocols that will govern cruise that are distinct. They will be based obviously on the broad entry protocols for the country, so mandatory PCR testing, any quarantining arrangements. But in this case, obviously, there is in existence already a sterile corridor between the airport and the seaport. So typically for air-to-sea transfers, a person would disembark a plane and they would go directly from the airplane in a secure transportation, using a secure transportation provider, either by a charter or by a scheduled flight, directly to the Bridgetown port with no stops in between. So there's no on-island activity. So we are mitigating for that as well and any risks associated with that. But the sterile corridor is meant to be maintained and there is to be no on-island activity between air and sea. But in any event, they will all be required to, one, be vaccinated. And by vaccinated, the new protocols require or define, I should say, fully vaccinated persons as persons who have received for 2-dose jabs, both doses, 14 days after. For 1-dose jabs, they will have the vaccination and 14 days after, plus a PCR test, plus they will be tested on arrival. So it's an extensive process. And I think the key thing here, Lisa, is that not everyone wants to subject themselves to those number of tests, and they're tested repeatedly in every jurisdiction. So if you're going on a 7-day cruise, for example, you're going to be tested repeatedly on board the ship as well. And in some destinations, we will be working with them to see what their entry protocols will look like. When you go on island and you're going to shore excursions, there are protocols that must govern that as well. And so these are persons who have made the investment in ensuring that they have, one, protected themselves with vaccinations, two, that they're being repeatedly tested, and that, three, the locations to which they are going are now certified as safe destinations and in compliance with our protocols, both here in Barbados and throughout the other countries that are on the itinerary. So it's taken quite a bit of work. It's been an extensive process. Prime Minister chairs the America's Cruise Task Force. I serve as her alternate, and we have looked at not just the Barbados draft protocols, we've looked at the CDC provisional sail order and what is required there. We have worked on the healthy sail guidelines from the European Union as well, and extracted over 116 specific items that are required in country for safe sailing to take place again. So it really has been an extensive body of work, and we're going to be testing it hopefully during the course of the summer months with the first sailings from Barbados.
Since we're on the topic of protocols, there was concern among Barbadians that the protocols were not strictly adhered to the last time. What level of assurance can you give Barbadians that you will try to stop every hole this time?
I think, let me start first by saying, Lisa, that one of the things that I think we have to do a lot more of is just information sharing on what exists. So there were people who did not follow the protocols, and that was something that we definitely were challenged by. We, for example, had persons who were arriving here and they were going to quarantine facilities. But you know, it's Christmas, right? So you're coming home for Christmas and your family is here, but you brought home goodies. And so your family comes to the airport to meet you. And before you get in to the transportation that's going to take you to your quarantine hotel, they come to get the packages and they hug you up and they kiss you. But you're going into quarantine and there's not meant to be any contact. Those are some of the things that we have to make sure don't happen again. We had people who were at hotels, for example, and you had family members who would leave and go to a quarantine hotel while the person is in quarantine to drop off food or something like that. And you had instances, at least one instance, where security had to be called in to remove persons from the property. And then you had other visitors who simply, as we saw in the courts, left to go and get a drink or a smoke. Those kinds of things. And we had one instance on the West Coast that everyone is very familiar with. So those are things that we did not want to see happen. We do not want to see happen. And the Royal Barbados Police Force, the COVID Enforcement Unit, and the compliance officers that are going to be assigned in each of the various properties will now be responsible for ensuring that whatever the applicable protocols are, that they are strictly adhered to, and that people who are determined to do the wrong thing, and hopefully, and I can only say hopefully, after all that we have gone through, after the lockdown, after the restrictions that we have had to deal with as a result of some of these challenges, I'm just hopeful that people understand the importance of doing the right thing, and that when it comes to visitors, we will make every effort as well, whether the visitors are our own or they're visiting from another country, that they too understand the importance of keeping themselves and us safe.
Now, I know you have some meetings planned with the various stakeholders, but have you had any early feedback as yet as it relates to reopening?
So we've had quite a number of meetings, Lisa, with the stakeholders, and it's an intense period of time for the sector. And sometimes when you talk to the stakeholders, the level of trauma that many of them have experienced is not a small thing. We have employers, owners of businesses who have worked for years and successive generations of their families to build businesses that they're watching implode before their eyes. And so they're desperate to do everything they can to preserve their businesses and their own futures. You have workers who equally so have not worked since March of last year in some instances. They're desperate to do whatever they can to be able to support their families again. You have attractions, for example, that have had to lay off staff members that to them are like family. They're desperate to be able to get back to work. And it is that desperation that is going to drive, in our view, the commitment to observance of the protocols in their strictest sense so that a reopening can actually happen. Now, the markets are telling us that for the UK, for example, the UK is still in lockdown. There is no expectation just yet until May that there will be some level of lifting of the restrictions. But even when that happens, they are going to be using what is being described as a traffic light system. And so countries that have air bridges, like Barbados typically did with the UK, for example, may benefit from a reopening of the UK market and a reopening of the Barbados market only insofar as we are successfully able to, one, contain the surge of our infection rates, manage what's happening with the number of deaths, but most importantly, address the issue of vaccinations. And so what we're seeing, and the G20 has a tourism recovery plan for reopening of the sector in those G20 economies, what we're seeing with a lot of those countries is that they are opening their air bridges and giving green lights to countries that have managed the scenarios that are presented to them well. So what we're expecting to see going forward now is that with the countries that are reopening, they're not reopening to everyone. Some countries will get a red light. And so it's important for us to be able to manage lockdowns, to be able to manage what is happening with infection rates and the risk, again, that risk mitigation that is being done, high risk, medium risk, low risk countries. We're going to be seeing a lot more of that to facilitate the reopening. We're also going to be looking in the industry at new ways of treating to the tourism sector. Historically, let's put a couple of things together in order to just put it in context. We've talked historically about Barbados as a small island developing state. We've talked about our vulnerability to climate change. We're in a moment where inexplicably and unbelievably we're navigating a COVID pandemic over an extended period of time and a volcano erupting, natural disaster in a neighboring country, which is creating a regional series of environmental refugees and evacuees from countries. Those are scenarios that we have in our worst case scenarios, always raised with the international community as part of our vulnerability as small island developing states. But you add to that we are small island developing states that are largely tourism dependent economies, and you're simultaneously dealing with a prolonged period of tourism decline. It says to us that there has to be a meaningful conversation around our tourism models, around what we have talked about in terms of the volume of passengers coming into Barbados, whether by air or by sea, and how we are able to move away from a dependency that is specific only to numbers. And here's what I mean. We're dealing with a scenario, Lisa, where Barbados has seen a significant decline in quantity, the quantity of visitors coming through the island. But we are still then having to rationalize how we're going to fill $1 billion hole in the government's balance sheet as a result of the absence of spend by visitors coming into a country to augment what we have domestically. And I want to put this in context. An economy that is largely driven by sectors like manufacturing, has a strong domestic manufacturing base, strong domestic travel, strong agricultural sector that can feed itself. Larger economies than ours have been able to sustain themselves, but they haven't been able to thrive. And that is what is happening globally. So what then of Barbados, the small island developing state, also tourism dependent, that does not have a large range of export-oriented industries that will generate revenue, including foreign exchange, to drive our economy, and tourism disappears. It simply means that the whole for us is large, just as it is for every other country, but the impact of that, it's a real issue. And it says to us that as a small island, we cannot survive on our own. We don't have the capacity. There has to be that inward flow of revenue that comes from sources outside of what we're able to generate domestically, simply based on economies of scale. And that brings us to the question. Historically, we have been talking about this over-tourism model. We're a small island, climate change, resilient, we have to preserve our ecosystems. We don't want these large numbers of visitors coming through the island because it's going to be destructive to the economy. We've talked about the absence of our ability through room stock to accommodate what these large numbers are, and we have to expand our capacity by way of rooms. What does that mean in a COVID environment? What does that say to us? That when this is all going, are we to camp out and wait for a return of the old model where we're bringing plane loads of visitors into country and we're making sure we're packing hotel beds on our own? Are we only going to be depending on revenue from those traditional sources, from the historical basis of international travel? I think the answer has to be no, Lisa. And so one of the things that we're spending a lot of time on now is looking at new models of tourism investment attraction. What does that mean? What does tourism investment attraction mean outside of only infrastructure, which is typically what we have spent resources on? We'll still have that. There's no replacing it. But there has to be an expansion of the scope. And so, for example, the combined value of at least 20 international airlines is the value of Zoom today. Why is that? Because with all that has happened, disruptive technologies have completely been overtaken by what our circumstances are now. And so is there a moment in time other than this where Barbados should be pushing for an aggressive development of disruptive technologies in the tourism industry? How do we use those disruptive technologies? Is there an opportunity for us to remove middlemen, for example, that take revenue out of the country and claim larger stakes of the value chain by establishing new companies, digital platforms, newly disruptive technologies being used to propel their way forward, and keep some of that revenue in new enterprises? How are we to bring more youth who come with a naivety and a bright-eyed nature that sometimes people who come from a different generation may not see? Because sometimes in a different generation, we think of what can't be done. But with youth and that energy that comes from our youth, we are seeing a number of really interesting companies up and coming and emerging in the sector and in the general economy that have the opportunity to transform the way in which we do business. We're also talking about structural transformation in the sector. And I'm talking about structural transformation at the enterprise level. A lot of work has to be done there to diversify the base of how our enterprises are structured. The BEST program is one of them, for example. So we're talking about preference shares and equity stakes. But how do we get more of that from a private sector base, bringing in additional capital? How do we then start to treat questions like renewable energy sources so that renewable energy comes not just as a measure to treat to climate change and climate resilience, but renewable energy becomes a part of our brand as Barbados for tourism. So there are so many other elements that we have to be able to develop. And then one of the key things for us that we're working on during the course of this year is skills and education. We typically think about skills and education as linked purely for jobs as part of a public good. And that's important. That is something that's going to be critical. But what we are also working on now is attracting international investment into Barbados with the top international hospitality and tourism education schools in the world, establishing a presence here in Barbados, participating in joint venture arrangements with our local institutions and with private sector partners, producing world-class niche specializations for Barbadians. But we can't stop there. That has to be a means of attracting investment into the country through international business, for example, corporation taxes and so on. But it also has to be an export industry for Barbados, where we're producing professional Barbadians, not just for employment here in country, but for export all around the world. So Barbados builds a new reputation for being the center of the world for high-class, globally rated international education in tourism and hospitality. Those are some of the new things that have to emerge from a new tourism model and our new tourism architecture.
Now, I want to go back to the BEST program that you mentioned. How has that program performed to date? Are you pleased with its performance? Have enough people bought into it?
People, when I'm here and you see the children that may be studying at home alone, it's on all the way to look out for them. So parents and guardians, if for any reason you have to leave home, remind your children to don't let nobody in the house, especially when no one else is at home. Nobody at all. And neighbors, you all in this too. Look out for the young ones and report anything suspicious. Educate the children. Tell them about the behavior that's inappropriate and unwanted. Tell them that the same way no one is to touch them inappropriately in person. Don't let people ask them the foolishness online either. Tell them to tell you, let you deal with it. And don't just leave them all over the place, especially with people that they are not comfortable with. Then things could do more harm than good. But listen, children got feelings too, so don't treat them like the invisible. Talk to them. Find out what's really going on with them online and otherwise. All of we got a role to play in keeping them safe. Man, once we work together, we can see this through. We got this.
Now, I want to go back to the BEST program that you mentioned. How has that program performed to date? Are you pleased with its performance? Have enough people bought into it?
So we have had to date 56 applications for the BEST program. 46 of those have been approved, and we have another one that I believe has been given conditional approval. And the expectation is that with the latest changes that we have made to the BEST program, and some of them were approved just recently by the cabinet, that there will be even more enterprises coming into the BEST program. And just a little bit on the program has three main components: a wages subsidy, a wages component really, to ensure that hotels are able to bring their workers back to work. And the obvious question is, what do workers do if we don't have people in the rooms? Key thing here for us is to make sure that we're using the time for training, upskilling, retraining, and keeping people's minds occupied, and also keeping the plant in use so that it doesn't fall into a state of dilapidation. There is a renewable energy component in the BEST program, and of course there is a digitalization component in the program, so that after a period of 24 months, because we don't know what will happen in the sector, the conservative forecasts project that tourism will recover by 2025. The optimistic forecasts are expecting that there will be a recovery by 2023, but we're already seeing extraordinarily strong signs of bookings for 2022 and even quarter 4 of 2021. So what we're hoping to be able to do with the BEST program is to write out at least a minimum period of 24 months that would allow us to see some recovery so that we're able to move into a new space with the businesses. And it's not just hotels, but direct tourism services are also included, including entities like attractions and so on.
So given the signs thus far, you're a little optimistic about the last quarter of this year. We will have, from what you're seeing, a fairly decent winter season, given all that has happened.
Well, given all that has happened, I would be crazy to actually begin to project that far out. Because from day to day, week to week, things will change. But if all things remain equal, and if the latter part of the year is as it is now, we are expecting that quarter 4 will be a quite strong period for us. So we're just hoping, and I think one of the key things for us there is to make sure that whatever we do between now and then, both here and in our source markets, because we don't exist on our own. So in our here and in our source markets, that we keep everything on an even keel. We follow the protocols. We continue with training. We keep the properties updated. We bring new product so that by the time people come, there's a refreshing that people are experiencing. And we're talking to Barbadians also about bringing back that spirit of hospitality. It's been a long time. and a difficult time for all of us. For Barbadians, being in lockdown, being at home, being anxious, being fearful, never knowing what to expect. And that takes a toll on people, you know? And it makes it very difficult sometimes to deal with something like a visitor coming in. But I think who we are requires us to ultimately say, you know what, we're going to be okay. We're going to be all right. We're going to do the right things and we're going to be okay. And we're also going to welcome our visitors because they are going to do the right things. And then we are all together going to be okay. We have to do it together. There's no other way, really.
Barbados has a very strong vaccination program. More than 60,000 people have already received their first dose. Are we looking at the introduction of a vaccination passport?
So we are expecting during the course of the coming days, actually, to receive a full presentation from IATA. We have indicated with IATA that we are prepared to pilot their travel pass. And that travel pass is being done. Virgin Atlantic has come on board very strongly. They will be our very first partner with whom we will pilot the travel pass. And really, what is a travel pass? The travel pass will allow us to receive information in advance on vaccinations, test results, and most importantly, test results from accredited laboratories. But there's another element to the travel pass, and it says, you know, when you're going from one country to another, you kind of want to know in advance what the express requirements are at the time, because protocols change all the time. And so, for example, for us, we stopped allowing downloads of the protocols because we found a scenario where each time they changed, someone may check in, a visitor may check in, or a Barbadian coming home may check in and say, what are the protocols for Barbados? Where do you find them? And someone says, oh, don't worry, I have them. And they send a dated version of what the protocols are. And then you have difficulty when you get to the airport because you no longer meet the current requirements. So one of the reasons why we have opted for the travel pass with IATA is because they have a platform that we already use called Thematics. And the Thematics platform uploads protocols live to each airline. And so when you book with the airline, you will automatically get information that says, this is what is required for the destination that you're flying to, in this case, Barbados. When you submit your booking information online prior to travel, you will get an approved tick which says you have met the entry requirements for Barbados even before you fly. And so when you get here, that allows for a far more seamless transition through Grantley Adams International Airport. All of the information goes to the relative agencies that need to have them, that need to have them, Immigration Department, public health officials, and then you're able to go from there. It also helps to avoid falsification of documentation because the lab results have to be submitted from an accredited laboratory. So only if there are accredited laboratories that have done your tests can it be uploaded into the platform. Otherwise, it would have to be a manual process. So we will be hopefully piloting from this month with Virgin Atlantic and IATA the travel pass. But that's not to say that there are not others, because there are several others that are being used by multiple airlines. So for example, some airlines use a VeriFly platform, some use another platform called have different passports. And in the same way that we are positioned to use multiple different types of passports, we use paper versus digital, we use kiosks and uploads, we have to be in a position to receive and read all kinds of digital passports. So while we're piloting one, the expectation is that we will be exploring others shortly thereafter.
Speaking of exploring others, where are we in terms of attracting new airlines?
So the latest airline we're very happy we announced last week is Aer Lingus, and they're going to be coming. It's an Irish line, and we have never had them flying to Barbados before. And I have Irish friends, and they have been messaging to say, this is fantastic news. We're so excited. We cannot wait to come to Barbados. So we're going to be seeing that. And then we should have some more announcements for you during the course of the year. But one of the things that I would say here in this context is that as part of the diversification of the tourism industry and the emergence of that new tourism architecture, one of the things that we're looking at now is an aviation strategy. And in the coming days and weeks, we will be launching the new project, which is to develop an aviation strategy for Barbados, which is to bring airlines to Barbados, again, diversifying beyond simply arrivals alone, but looking at a range of services. So here is this little island, most southerly island in the Caribbean. You've got the African coast to one side, and you've got the South American coast down below, and the Caribbean just beyond. We're in an ideal position, most southerly position. And that allows us to look at what opportunities there are for aviation generally and aircraft. And so we are going to be looking at aircraft coming to Barbados as we develop new aircraft maintenance and repair services, new private aircraft services as well. We are also going to be looking at hangar services. We are also going to be exploring how best we use the land surrounding the Grantley Adams International Airport to create what we are now calling an aviation center of excellence, which will then create direct and indirect linkages to aircraft and to aviation more generally, to be able to build an entirely new industry that is a $1 trillion industry globally and is creating over 62 million jobs in the Americas alone. Barbados has to have a share of that new industry. And again, I make the point, this cannot be an era where we're talking about tourism that is dependent only on revenue derived from international arrivals coming on planes or on ships. It has to be a lot more. And that's what we're focusing our attention on now. What is that more?
Outside of attracting new carriers, we have some airlines that have been with us for quite a long time who are also struggling. What's been the feedback from them in terms of when they resume full flights again?
They're struggling, yes, but they're extraordinarily excited to return to Barbados. But we've met with many of the partners over the last few weeks, and 2 weeks ago, for example, we met with all of the tour operators out of the UK, and the airlines are chomping at the bit to return to Barbados. And so we have out of the US, American Airlines and JetBlue that continue flying. We have British Airways and Virgin Atlantic. We consolidated a significant number of flights, obviously, over the last few months, but they're all looking back to resuming normal service, where we have 2 flights a day, if not more, coming into Barbados. And then we also are expanding, in some instances, into cargo operations with those airlines, because while there was a complete depletion of air travel for passengers, cargo was untouched. Cargo continued to move, and that is, again, another latent opportunity that we have to build and we have to expand on.
Let's look at attractions, most notably Harrison's Cave. What's going on with Harrison's Cave and the new management company?
So the management agreement for Harrison's Cave was completed in September of last year. The company that was successful is a company out of Jamaica called Chaka. We are Caribbean region, and so the movement of capital and the establishment of commercial presence is something that's very important to all of us. And certainly for me as a committed regionalist, I would love to see a lot more Barbadian businesses expanding out into the region, and that's one of actually the push areas of emphasis for the Ministry of Tourism. Why would the next Sandals, for example, or the next major attraction not come from a Barbadian investor that has taken over in the same way we're seeing others come here and build businesses to do? So what Chaka has done so far, and they're hoping to be able to reopen by October, they have taken a single attraction, which was Harrison's Cave and the cave itself, and they have created it into 5 different attractions. So when Harrison's Cave reopens, you're going to see an entirely new look arrangement. You're going to be seeing an aviary, a bird aviary, an area where people can interact with the monkeys, a dedicated area. You're going to be seeing a zip line. There's also going to be a pool where you can have a swim-up bar and all of that, where friends and families can gather. There's going to be a dedicated children's play area, a rum tasting hub where you can go and taste and sample rum in the beauty of the cave. And you're also going to have an experience that is very similar to bungee jumping as well, which takes you from the top down to the bottom of the gully. So it's an entirely new look for Harrison's Cave. It's a $6 million investment between now and October. And so we're very excited about the reopening of Harrison's Cave. It's an interesting thing also because 60% of the business of Harrison's Cave comes from cruise. So it's important for us to be able to share with Barbadians the real linkages between when we see arrivals or we see ships and so on, and tourism industry that you typically may think of, and the sustainability of our businesses. 60% of the business of Harson's Cave comes from the cruise industry.
There's been a concern over the years about attractions and properties being priced out of the reach of the average Barbadian. Tourism is not for staycations. We've experienced some good staycation rates because locals have been enjoying them. What do you say to Barbadians who are of that mindset?
Philip Seven here, and I want to applaud all you teachers and principals for the phenomenal job you're doing. COVID-19 has changed the way you teach, but you took up the challenge to find innovative ways and you rose to the occasion. It is challenging, yes. It is stressful, yes, but massive kudos to getting it done. But as you care for your students, I want you to take care of yourself too. Here are some ideas. Practice healthy eating habits. You are what you eat. Stay active, even if for just 10 or 15 minutes a day. A healthy body is as important as a healthy mind. Make time to relax, meditate, listen to some music, read a book, or simply nap. Remember, the way children need breaks, so do you. Unplug. COVID, exhaustion, and information overload are real and can take a mental toll. Reduce the time spent on sites and platforms which add to your feelings of anxiety. While teaching may be your superpower, accept that you aren't superhuman. Don't overextend yourself. Be assertive, but don't feel guilty for saying no. You cannot be everything to everyone. As the older people would say, you can't pour water from an empty cup. So, take care of yourself and we'll get through this together. We got this.
There's been a concern over the years about attractions and properties being priced out of the reach of the average Barbadian. Tourism is not for staycations. We've experienced some good staycation rates because locals have been enjoying them. What do you say to Barbadians who are of that mindset?
I think there are two things that I would say. Barbados has to be for Barbadians first, and the first visitor has to be a Barbadian. There are so many people who we've interacted with who have never been to some of our attractions. Price isn't the only consideration. Sometimes is that we just take them for granted, or we think that they're for other people. But I want Barbadians to feel a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. Chaka, for example, has established the Chaka Foundation to support the community around the Allen View community around Harson's Cave. And so they're going to be adopting a school, they're going to be publishing a book, they're going to be providing kiosks for the community around to have entrepreneurial opportunities. And so it's not only about encouraging Barbadians to visit the attractions and pay a price to enter or to view them, but it's also about creating opportunities for Barbadians to own a stake in these attractions. And one of the areas of emphasis for my ministry is very much that. But it's not just domestic tourism. What we are focusing on is community owned and community led, because there has to be enfranchisement and the democratization of access as it relates to ownership. That's one of the areas of emphasis for our ministry. So I don't want us to have a narrow conversation at all. Only about pricing. Barbadians also need to be owners.
I'm glad that you mentioned community-based tourism. How do you get Barbadians again to be ready to welcome visitors again?
Well, the first thing you're going to probably see from us in the coming months, now that we have started to reopen, is the relaunch of the Barbados to Come From program and a program for locals. We have to get Barbadians feeling that sense of ownership over our patrimony. I confess a lot of times, well, aside from the fact I don't have a lot of time for myself, but I probably haven't been to the beach for the year. And I know that I'm not the only one. I know that many Barbadians, despite the fact that we had the restrictions on the beach, have not been to the beach in a really long time. But it's part of our own, it's part of our patrimony. Many Barbadians have never been to Watch Mahal Gully. They've never been to Animal Farm. You've never been. You see, there you go, Lisa. I remember I've been to Watch Mahal Gully, but it's when my daughter was younger and we went zip lining. I thought it was one of the most amazing experiences that I've had. Many people have never been to Animal Flower Cave, and it's stunningly beautiful.
So I've seen from the pictures.
You see, you've never been
I've
either?
never been.
There you go. So we have to get out there. More Barbadians have to be able to see what we have. If you want to sell what you have, we have to know what it is. And we have to feel as though it belongs to us. So when I think about some of our attractions, for example, there's an opportunity, for example, I think Prime Minister was talking about this. I heard her make reference to it just a few days ago. And she says we would rather, in some instances, be 100% in charge of something that's really small, rather than to take community ownership of it and make it into something that's much bigger. I would love to be able to see some of the phenomenal products that exist in our communities, that are our attractions, have community-associated businesses connected to them. When we started the Barbados to Come From program last year, for example, we went to Andromeda Gardens, and then we left Andromeda Gardens and we went to a bar right there, a local bar right there overlooking Bathsheba. It was stunning. And one of the things that we worked on coming out of that was empowering those local bars and restaurants, connecting tours from the attractions into local locations for lunch and rum shop crawls and those kinds of things. So people are able to benefit from not just the attraction being in their community, but the authentic Barbadian experience that people are coming here to experience.
Now, there's talk about a new tourism investment model. You would have touched on it earlier, and repositioning the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc. to become more commercially viable. How are you planning to go about that?
So one of the things about the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc. is that it has gone through multiple incarnations. Everybody remembers the Barbados Tourism Board, Barbados Tourism Authority, Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc., followed by the Barbados Tourism Products Authority, the merging of the two. Now you have the BTMI. We're at different stages in our life cycle each time we've looked at that given institution. At this point, we have to be able to look at what the studies are telling us. We announced in 2018 that we will be moving towards a public-private partnership arrangement with the BTMI. COVID happened in 2019, and so capital flight became a real thing, and reduced access to revenues became a real thing. And so it was very difficult to be able to launch that new model during the course of this last year and a half or so. But now, in this moment, it becomes even more critical. A lot of the research is saying to us that there has to be a change to what the destination management organizations are doing. They're saying to us that there is a big change that has been occasioned by social media and user-generated content. So we have to be able to look on the one hand at what's happening with the marketing of the destination, but also how do we again attract investment, attract revenues through more entrepreneurial and more corporate type activities. And the BTMI has to be in the vanguard of those changes. And so we are going to be moving now to look at a far more entrepreneurial and a corporate style approach for the BTMI. How do we create those linkages, meaningful linkages between our destination and the productive sectors? How do we create linkages between our iconic products? How do we create linkages between our overseas markets on a continuous basis, with or without visitors coming to Barbadian products and services? And the BTMI has to very much be a critical part of that. So one, we will be moving aggressively towards setting it up as a PPP, benefiting from private sector investment. And secondly, we will be having a far more corporate style approach to the BTMI, which includes and is premised, of course, on the marketing of the destination, but has to go beyond that now.
Where are you with the PPP for the Gaia Inc.?
So for Gaia Inc., we are expecting to have our upcoming bidders conference this month, I believe it is. And so we are hoping there are still 13 bidders. They too are anxious. There have been lots of changes in the global economy since we started the process. And so the bidders conference is going to see what we call a new transaction structure. And by that, it means that when we started, it's not where we are now, and the forecasts have changed. So what we've done is a couple of things. One, we have built what we call a rebalancing clause into the agreement. And that rebalancing clause means that if the pessimistic scenario obtains, that in time, if that extends over time, that we don't have to renegotiate the agreement, but we make appropriate changes within the context of the agreement that does not disadvantage the government of Barbados or the concessionaire. If the optimistic scenario and we recover faster than we actually thought, then we'd make sure that we make the necessary changes in the agreement without having to go through the process all over again. I think everybody is familiar with the fact that if you negotiate a contract now, whatever the terms are now in this moment, they are whatever they're going to be. We as a government have made sure that we don't have that. We inbuilt the rebalancing clause, we've undertaken the forecasting analysis, we've looked at what the investment models may need to be for the airport, and the aviation strategy is a critical and important adjunct to that as well, because it will also allow for the attraction of additional investment. So even if there's a concessionaire that is not successful as the bidder for the airport, they have the opportunity to invest in other elements. And one of the key things that I would want to emphasize here is that, one, the airport is not being sold. 2, the airport is not being sold. 3, the airport is not being sold. And perhaps if I'm talking about that, Harson's Cave has not been sold. Harson's Cave has not been sold. Harson's Cave is not being sold. So for Gaia Inc., each of those 13 bidders was required to have a local partner as well. So there is a local component to the investment associated with Gaia Inc. And that's what we mean about democratization of financing and of access. There must always be local participation, not just in capital, but by the transfer of knowledge and networks through those international relationships.
My final question to you. Earlier you said that you're a regionalist.
Yep.
Now we well know that Caribbean tourism is very competitive. How does Barbados set itself apart when things reopen fully?
Well, that's an interesting question because I happen to simultaneously be the chairman of the Caribbean Tourism Organization.
We know.
So I think I'm a dedicated regionalist, yes. But typically when you listen to what people are saying when they're coming from source markets, I'm going on a Caribbean vacation. I'm going to the Caribbean for sun, sea, and sand. Or I'm going to have a Caribbean experience. And then they drill down to which Caribbean experience they're going to be having. There is real value in exploiting that commonality that the Caribbean has. And it is on that basis that the CARICOM heads of government have actually agreed that there needs to be a common CARICOM tourism policy. And that draft is underway and it's being worked on by a dedicated committee so that there are some areas where, one, we focus, of course, on the immediate term and the recovery and the reopening of our markets. And then we build out a little later in areas where we have those commonalities, in areas where we can cooperate, in areas where there are potential synergies to be built. And then in other areas, we remain competitors. And I used an example many years ago wearing my trade hat, where we were asked to develop an export product of a given commodity. And each individual producer was unable to meet the demand that was being required. But if we were to accumulate the resources, we could have met the demand. And equally so for tourism. There are some areas in which we are absolutely going to have to collaborate. Cruising, for example, is one of those areas where we have to collaborate because there are multiple countries on an itinerary. But the experience that I'm going to have in Barbados is going to be different to the experience I'm going to have in Dominica, for example. Yet we're collaborating. So there are commonalities and complementarities, and I think we need to emphasize those most. But where those things do not exist, we have to be as competitive as we can be. We have to be as efficient as we can be at marketing Barbados aggressively and putting Barbados as that. I think we have now created a new campaign which we're preparing to launch, and it's called Little Island Big. We are that little island big, and big in every possible way, including big on ambition. And so we are very much committed to the idea and to the reality that we have to be the best tourism destination in the world.
Thank you so much, Minister Cummins. That was the Minister of Tourism and International Transport, Senator the Honorable Lisa Cummins, and I'm Lisa Lord, and this was One on One.